Baroness Wolf.
Thank you very much. Is this this is working okay? Yes? Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. And because this session is about the global context of higher education, I think that is very much what I'm going to speak about. But I want first to say where I come from, because the United Kingdom is normally seen as having one of the most successful university systems in the world, and I think rightly so. But I think for the purposes of today's discussion and what I'm going to talk about, I think it's also important to understand that at the moment the universities are actually undergoing a level of critical scrutiny and indeed criticism, which is extremely unusual, and they're also seen as facing a funding crisis. So we have a new review of tertiary post-18 funding, of which I'm a member, taking place in a context of a growing sense that the system is actually, however successful, also unstable. And so what I want to ask you to do this evening is to think about how extraordinary the last 50 years of higher education have been globally. And I think we don't often understand how much universities can be seen as the defining and the most successful and often privileged institutions of our time. We don't notice it because they are old, and also, dare I say, because most of us went there at a time when what we were aware of was a sort of a continuity. We went to university which was not so different from the one that older members of our family had been to if we came from established families, or that people had aspired to for many years. But what has happened in the last half-century is that higher education across the globe has exploded. It is simply gigantic. Nobody arriving, looking at the size of our university sectors, could be anything but astonished. And this means that although they still fulfill their core purposes of identifying and forming national elites and encouraging and perpetuating and taking forward scholarship, they have also become something which is quite different. First of all, they are critically important in forming not just national elites, but the global elites, which are themselves under so much political pressure in many of our countries. There is a growing sense in our populations, I think, in many parts of the world, and certainly across Europe, an alienation from an elite which is seen as increasingly detached from its home culture, increasingly global, increasingly talking to itself, and not so much rooted in the country from which it comes. But I think even more important, this vast increase in participation rates means that the things that people took for granted about universities, including the fact that to go to university was not merely a privilege but a passport to prosperity, that assumption has been undermined at speed, and our societies have not yet taken account of what this is going to bring. Because across Europe, we are moving towards a world in which pretty much half of our young people start university. And that means, to take a biblical phrase, that we are turning our cultures and our societies into ones in which we have sheep and goats, and those groups are pretty much equal in size. And this is a very, very different and much less stable situation in many ways from one in which a very small elite, hopefully meritocratic, was selected and went forward into university. And in this sense, Greece and the UK are actually quite alike, because we both have, even by European standards, very high participation rates. Now, one of the things that this has meant, and again this is a global issue, is that we are spending a very great deal of money on higher education. In the OECD average, for example, we are getting on for 2% of GDP on higher education. That is a lot of money. Okay, it's not as much as we spend on health, it's not as much as we spend on education overall, but it's a great deal of money. And what is also, to me, very striking is that the amount we spend on higher education is getting on for half of what we spend on the whole of primary and secondary education. So we are spending per student much, much more on these 4 years of higher education that go to half our population than we are spending per student per year in the 13 years to which most of our citizens aspire. So why has this happened, and what is this inequality telling us? Well, I think it's crept up on us, and it's crept up on us for 2 or 3 reasons, one of which, of course, is that universities are the home of the elite, and we treasure them and we look after them, and we therefore don't really question for a long time whether this is a reasonable way to do it. These interests are buttressed by a belief in the right to education, the right to free education, and I think this is probably something which in the context of the question and answer session will come up again. And we've also been bolstered in spending so much without really questioning whether we were sensible to do so by what I have called the growth delusion, the idea that because in the past, anybody who went to university earned more, having more people go to university was automatically good for the economy and therefore could be seen as an investment. But there is an increasing gulf between people's experience of education in universities, between what they expect when they graduate from university and this belief that politicians have shared. And in my own country, this is becoming a very major issue. I think I'd like to say finally just 2 things. I've said that the pressure of the cost of higher education is a global issue. You can nonetheless, I think, divide the world's higher education systems up into 2 major trajectories. There are those countries where, like in the UK, like in the US, there has been a real move to bring private money into the system as a way of bolstering the contribution of the state. And those are the countries, brutally, which have actually tended to have the globally most successful universities. They've also tended to be those which have accepted competition and which have not felt that free education was an automatic right in a system which was open only to part of the population. But that also has its tremendous problems. It has a real tension when some universities are increasingly seen as better than others, and this is something which is our problem. On the other side, and this is something that I have learned about Greece, you are very much part of that group of countries which has seen higher education as something where you want to keep it equal across the university sector. That is very commendable in some ways, and it makes universities more rooted in their local societies. But I would venture to say that in a world where, in spite of my saying that there is a growth delusion, growth and entrepreneurship and innovation are increasingly tied to university laboratories and research, and I know that my colleague is going to talk about this, this creates a different sort of tension because it's very difficult to have a mass education system of high quality. In fact, I would say impossible to have a mass education system of equal quality and high quality in a world where half the population is going into higher education and the pressure is for further growth. Thank you very much.